Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to SES seminar series. And this is John, and I will be with our communication specialist, Kathy, to be as a moderator. And just so you know, that this seminar is being recorded, and the video will be later available on our YouTube channel. And you are welcome to bring up any questions. You can chat us, or you can unmute yourself so that we can hear you. And today we are very excited to have our distinguished speaker, Professor Loboda, joining us from UMD. And our Associate Director, Prof. is also joining us. So I'm going to turn this over to Prof, and he will be introducing the speaker. So Prof, please go ahead.
No, Ralph's audio is broken, John, so you can.
Oh, okay, got you. Okay, so Ralph got some technical issues with his mic, so I'm going to go ahead introducing the speaker. So the Professor Loboda is a professor and chair in the Department of Geographic Science and University of Maryland. She is an expert in geospatial data science and satellite remote sensing, and works extensively with satellite observations, space-time modeling, climate change science, and health applications. Her research interests include wildland fire, biodiversity, climate change, public health, and their interactions with other human and physical factors on the landscape. Geographically, her research is mostly focused on boreal forest and tundra biomass, although she is also involved with studies of temperature and tropical ecosystems. She is a member of leadership board for the GeoHealth section of the American Geophysical Union. And today we will be hearing she talking about the interesting malaria studies. So Professor, please proceed.
Thank you so much. So thank you everybody for being here today. This is really a wonderful and rare opportunity, whoops, sorry about that, to give a talk that is not horribly constrained by 8-minute timing that you have to rush through, and you can actually take your time and talk about things that are important in great detail. So thank you again for having me. I'm going to talk about bringing Earth observations to support the global malaria elimination agenda. And specifically, I'm going to talk about our Myanmar malaria early warning system, which we lovingly call MMEWS. Although I am the only person listed on the program, it's really, as always, a combination of very many people who contributed a lot of time and effort to making this work. We have a big group here at the Department of Geographical Sciences, as well as my dear colleagues, formerly of Duke University, Dr. Christopher Plow in Myanmar. They are malariologists, and Popo Ang of the Duke Global Health Institute in Myanmar is our in-country collaborator. Just to start with acknowledging the funding sources, the early warning system itself has been funded through the NASA Applied Sciences Program, the Health and Air Quality Applications Program, and specifically under the GEO for Health project grant. But there are lots of basic research components that worked into the development of this system that have been funded by other sources. It really takes a lot of time and effort, and a lot longer than just 3 years, to develop something that's meaningful in terms of decision support systems. So on the way to developing this early warning system, we had grants that were supported by NIH, International Center of Excellence for Malaria Research Program, NASA Land Cover Land Use Change Program, and a couple of grants from Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So I'm talking about malaria, and knowing that very few people in the audience are probably very familiar with the subject, indulge me just for a few minutes to talk about what malaria is, because to my own surprise, I knew very, very little when I started working with it. And you really need to understand a lot more to be able to create meaningful decision support systems. So malaria is a tropical disease. The way CDC summarizes, it's something that looks like this. And as you look at it puzzled for the next 30 seconds, I gotta tell you, the brief version summary of this, it's extremely complicated. I'm gonna break it down into very small chunks that are gonna make enough sense for us as people who are doing Earth observations to make enough sense, but hopefully help you understand later why we did the things the way we did. Malaria is caused by parasites. These are Plasmodium parasite species that cause disease not only in humans, but in other animals as well. There are 4 specific species that are cause malaria in humans. And the 2 that are shown in bold here, Falciparum and Vivax, are the most prevalent, and the ones that we're going to focus on the most in this talk. Plus, there is the 5th one, Nolsi, which is a zoonotic malaria that does cause malaria in humans, but still needs monkeys as an intermediary host. So the parasites are the ones that cause the actual malaria symptoms. But as true parasites, they are completely unable to survive for any length of time outside a host. And it has 2. There are vectors who are mosquitoes, and specifically Anopheles species. There are very, very many Anopheles mosquitoes. And the vectors deposit those parasites into people, where the parasites go through a certain stage of development before they emerge in the bloodstream, where they are again passed over to vectors that now host parasites for the next part of the cycle before they can be deposited back into people again. So it's complicated, but the gist of this is you really need to have parasites, vectors, and people together to make this disease work. If one of those components is missing, there is no malaria. So vectors and parasites, no malaria. People and vectors, no malaria. People and parasites, malaria for a very short time, and then it dies out. You really kind of need the whole loop to make it work. So globally, malaria is a huge problem, right? It's spread across 87 countries in the tropics, with the majority of cases and deaths really concentrated in Africa. The top map here shows the Plasmodium falciparum clinical cases. That's the most brutal malaria that usually has the worst outcomes and causes most severe symptoms and frequently death, especially in small children in Africa. The Vivax malaria that's shown in the bottom map is a little bit different. It has different, less severe symptoms, fewer deaths, but the problem is it is reoccurring as the parasites hide in the liver and then re-emerge, causing another bout of malaria without any new infection necessarily. So globally in 2019, there were nearly 230 million cases and over 4,000 deaths caused directly by malaria. But that is progress, right? And the progress in combating malaria globally has been very, very impressive. Even since 2010, worldwide, we have dropped malaria cases and malaria deaths tremendously. And as you can look at the 2020, which is now, and this is a map projecting how it should look from 2018, it's really where malaria is now. It's very close to the target of where we want to be, and we're hoping to completely eliminate malaria by 2040. The global malaria elimination strategy really has very specific targets that are articulated very clearly, and the interim targets that were set for 2020, we made some of them, which is eliminated malaria in at least 10 countries and prevented resurgence in those countries that were malaria-free. But we fell a little bit short of reducing cases by 40% and reducing deaths by 40%. We are doing well, though, in both falciparum, which is here on the left, and Vivax malaria elimination. The 2030 targets are hoping by reduction in cases by 90% and deaths by 90%, and eliminating malaria in at least 35 countries. But we are now seeing a substantial sloth in the progress that has been made, and even an ever so slight resurgence in the number of cases you can see here, both for falciparum and Vivax between 2018 and 2019. And 2019 is the most current data that we have. There is more to be concerned about. This slowing of progress comes at a time when there is a growing concern about the spreading drug resistance in parasite populations. The reason why we were able to so successfully reduce malaria is because we found the drug that is extremely effective, right? Or a family of drugs based on the artemisinin. There is now a number of parasites that are developing resistance to those drugs, where the treatments are no longer effective. Another component why we were so successful were the insecticide interventions that were preventing mosquitoes from biting people and therefore transmitting malaria. There are also mosquitoes that are developing mutations that making them insecticide resistant. And that's by and large happening in the Greatermekong Area. This wonderful op-ed article by my colleague and phenomenal malariologist Christopher Plow describes the lone malaria battle history and how the two previous campaigns essentially failed once the parasites were able to develop resistance to the available drug therapies. And at the end of this article, he's really urging to increase the efforts that we are doing to combat malaria in the Greatermekong Area, because the drug resistance there is spreading, it is growing. And if it spins out of control, we run the risk of a huge resurgence of malaria in other parts of Asia, and especially in Africa. Essentially, if we lose the battle in the Mekong, we can lose the battle with malaria globally again. The Greatermekong Area is here in the circles. Clearly not the most malarious place in the world, but of critical importance. And what makes it important is the fact that it has been the hotbed of previous emergence of drug-resistant malaria and current emergence of insecticide-resistant parasites. And as you can see, it's not just limited to a single country. It really is spread out through the entire region as a whole. And this region is immediately adjacent to Bangladesh and India on the other side, where the number of malaria cases is very high, and there is a big concern where the next stage of drug resistance is going to be spreading. within the Greatermekong region, Myanmar is a very special case of its own, right? If you look at this, this is Myanmar, this is the rest of the countries of the Greatermekong region. And by the other countries, we're talking about Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam, not your, Asian dragon countries in terms of development, but comparatively speaking, Myanmar has been carrying the disproportional burden of malaria in the region. And part of the reason is for the longest time, it has been cut off from the international community because of the political situation that it had in the country with the military government that pretty much took over the power. And only in 29, they started gradual opening to the outside world, which brought in the needed expertise and funding into the country, which led to a very rapid decline in malaria cases and malaria deaths, so that by 2019, it actually was not the worst case in the Southeast Asia. It has less reported malaria than Cambodia did. But what you also see in this particular case is that there seems to be quite substantial amount of resurgence, particularly again in Myanmar by 2019, which is the confidence interval showing that we're not entirely sure there may be quite substantial increase in malaria cases. But what they have been able to achieve over those 5 years is unprecedented. 82% drop in malaria cases between 2012 and 2017 is definitely something that is just tremendous. Unfortunately, as your malaria lake is starting to drain and it turns into pools and then puddles, finding where those remaining bits of malaria are to completely eliminate them becomes more and more challenging. And that is when we need to rely on mathematical models and space-time models that are going to help us identify those areas to enable the malaria elimination completely. In Myanmar, situation is a lot more challenging, as always. Part of the reason is what you have seen, the data that I presented earlier is on reported cases of malaria. Malaria cases are reported only when they are identified in population. Actually, what COVID has given us a lot of a better insight into what the medical community has been talking about for years. Malaria in Myanmar is very largely asymptomatic, meaning that there are a lot of carriers of parasites without having the symptoms, and therefore they don't even necessarily know that they carry malaria and are spreading malaria. But to eliminate malaria, it really requires eliminating of all parasites. And what asymptomatic malaria really looks like is like this hippo, mostly submerged underwater. What we're seeing in the official data is the ears and eyes, right? The rest of the hippo, which is a lot bigger than the ears, is completely invisible. Our data that come from one township in Rakhine State, where we did very extensive blood testing, showed then 2 studies separated about 5 years apart, about 1,000 participants in each. We were able to find only one person who was positive by the rapid diagnostic test, which is the standard testing in the field, very portable, but really requires very, very high level of parasites in the blood to trigger positive result. Versus an ultra-sensitive PCR test, which can be done only in the lab, very sensitive equipment, requires more blood, identified that 92 people were actually carrying malaria parasites in them. And only one of them was clinically identified. 5 years later, the results are pretty much the same, which means that we have a substantial pool of silent malaria in the country that we need to eliminate in order to achieve those eradication goals. It gets more difficult. When malaria's official numbers are reported and you see that annual parasite index on the left, you have idea of cases that were registered. But if you compare this with the map on the right that shows social vulnerability, you will see that a very large part of Myanmar is within areas that are extreme outliers in terms of development, conflict-affected areas, hubs in conflict-affected areas, and very low access to basic services and infrastructure. That means that these areas, particularly the border regions, the data that we have for them is far from incomplete, very sporadic, and very, very unreliable, I would say. So we don't really know how much parasitemia we have in the country that is plagued by so much military conflict and poor access to services. And all that got even worse with the military coup in February of 2021. So that all brings us to the point of modeling risk of malaria to support malaria elimination. In our approach, we define risk as an overlap of hazard, exposure, and vulnerability. This is the framework that has been established by IPCC, and it's a really wonderful, flexible framework that can be and has to be adapted to each individual disaster that you're trying to model. So within that, for malaria risk, it is the parasites and it is the mosquitoes. Where does malaria come from? It's really those guys in terms of people. Malaria vectors, the Anopheles mosquitoes in the Greatermekong region, are a wonderful, diverse community. A very, very recent study just came out. It's a phenomenal study. Granted, it is mostly conducted in northern Cambodia, but it's unprecedented in its detail that has been done. Shows that there is over 29, I believe, over 32 different species of Anopheles mosquito that are found in that area, with 22 of those are carrying Plasmodium parasites. The diversity of Anopheles mosquitoes also means that their biting behavior and ecology are very, very different, and they vary quite substantially from the assumptions we have been making for decades about what mosquitoes are supposed to do. Mosquitoes in Myanmar don't disappear the way they do in Africa when it gets dry. Myanmar is a wonderful place to be a mosquito, and they bite year-round. They bite in the dry season, they bite in the rainy season, they bite in the forest, they bite in the villages, they bite in the plantations. You name it, they are going to be there. And when I, in my interviews, asked people, when do you see mosquitoes? They didn't even understand the question I was asking, because the mosquitoes there all the time, throughout the year. A little bit more at the dusk and dawn, but you can find them during the daytime as well as at nighttime. Myanmar is truly a mosquito paradise. This is a model that models just one of those 22 species of Anopheles mosquitoes. And you can see the whole country of Myanmar is well covered by lovely habitat to be a mosquito. The exposure component of malaria risk is really looking at how do people get exposed to malaria. And that comes primarily from two things. How do they live? There is a big difference if you live in this village versus you live in this town. They're in the same township, by the way. We passed through this town to get to that village, right? So, but the drastic difference in the building environment and in the living environment of people make them differently exposed to malaria. And another very important component is, what do they do? Do they work in plantations? Do they work in mining areas? Do they farm? Is it a rain-fed agriculture? Is it flooded crops, or is it fishing opportunities? Each of them carries a different level of exposure to malaria. And then the final piece is vulnerability. Why are some people more likely to get sick? Part of it is genetic, part of it is immune system dependent. But then the other component of vulnerability is, why is it harder to get treatment? And a lot of it has to deal with accessibility. How close are you to the treatment center? And what are the roads that are going to get you there? This, for example, is one of the remote villages. The guys are wearing helmets for a reason. The only reason to get there on a motorized vehicle is go by a motorbike, right? And as you can imagine, during the monsoon season, these are the roads. They never get bigger than this. And these roads get flooded and washed out, and it's really hard to get anywhere. So, what can we do with Earth observations to look at malaria risk? Clearly, we can do just about absolutely nothing for the parasite identification. We very, very well can do a lot with modeling mosquito habitats. And that's where the most thrust of malaria efforts previously has been. We've been looking at mosquitoes and equating malaria with mosquitoes, which in some areas is a reasonable assumption. In Myanmar, it is not, because everything is good for mosquitoes, more or less, right? What we bring you to this whole malaria risk modeling is we use satellite data, auxiliary spatial data, and field surveys to look at the exposure and vulnerability components as well within the malaria risk framework. We really do combine all three components together to look at what malaria, the risk of an outbreak of malaria looks like. And we do it within the scope of the malaria burden potential MBP model, which has 3 individual submodules that are then combined through different weight system into the MBP parameter. So we have hazard, exposure, and vulnerability, and we use satellite observations for all of them. For hazard specifically, we're really looking at vector abundance prediction through surface water, surface temperature, and vegetation stress. And we're basing a lot of our analysis on the base map that we developed to specifically reflect classes that are meaningful for malaria studies and malaria risk modeling. We did not focus on every classes that are important for other components. We only picked the classes that are going to be meaningful to reflect malaria risk. And then we're doing analysis within these different objects as defined by classes. So the vector habitat modeling and monitoring, we're looking at 8-day repeat frequency using MODIS observations, and we're using vegetation stress at 250-meter resolution, as well as land surface temperature, both daytime and nighttime. These original data come at 1-kilometer resolution, but we're downscaling them to 250-meter resolution, and fairly successfully. One thing that you probably noticed here is the big gap filled part. Anybody who works in the tropics, in the monsoon-dominated areas, knows that about 3-4 months out of the year, you don't have any observations, right? Because the visible and short infrared energy does not really penetrate the thick cloud cover that gets established there and never leaves throughout the entire period. So a lot of our effort is to make the Earth observations that we have applicable to ensure continuous monitoring. And there are several things that we have to do with that. First, instead of using the typical, on average, monsoon in Myanmar goes sometime between May and sometimes through October, we identify in a particular year when the monsoon onset occurred and when the monsoon period finished. We're using cloud cover from land surface observations to look at the establishment and lifting of the continuous, which we defined as 3 consecutive 8-day periods of cloud cover in the year. And 8-day composites already mean that they're pretty much looking for any available observations during that time. And if the observations are cloudy, it pretty much means that the cloud cover was there the entire time. So we generate monsoon onset and monsoon end for every pixel within the area for every year. The next thing we do is we figure out how to gap fill the land surface temperature observations. Once you screen the available observations, and this is in mid-June, this is June 18th in 2016, a typical mid-monsoon observation day. For entire Myanmar, there are so few valid observations. The red here is the mask that shows cloud cover or missing observations for whatever reason. There are parts of the country that don't see sunlight for the next 4 months. And trust me, you literally don't see the sunlight, because I spent 30 days there once during the monsoon season and swore never to do it again. So we develop approaches to gap fill those observations to create a continuous, although modeled, approximation of what those observations would be over a particular day. And then we downscale them to 250-meter resolutions to create continuous gap-filled observations of land surface temperature, both through daytime and nighttime. And of course, at this resolution, you can see that everything always looks beautiful. There are more artifacts as you zoom in, but that's pretty much unavoidable anyway. So apology for leaving Myanmar here. I didn't feel like reprojecting it from the native MODIS sinusoidal projection. Those of you who know MODIS get used to looking at the world sideways most of the time. Here's an example of what we do with gap filling and DVI, but then you don't, to run this decision-making system forward, you also need to be able to predict the next value, which is missing in observations. And we have come up with a fairly simple approach here. So what we do is we first calculate 3-year means of gap-filled observations, and that's the blue line. Here you have 2 pixels, 2 random pixels that illustrate what it looks like. So the blue line shows 3-year mean of previous 3 years. The red crosses show you the actual observations of a given year, and the green line with circles fitted here shows you the predicted value, that what we would expect if we don't get an observation and we don't have the full year of data. So we're following the actual data until we miss the first observation. At that point, we take the difference between the observed data and the 3-year mean, and we apply the same difference following the trajectory of 3-year mean observations. We can make that assumption because generally during the monsoon season, nobody starts logging. All actual activity generally stops, right? Because the amount of rain and the impassability of different routes is extreme. It's really hard to get from one place to another, and it's really, really hard to do any kind of logging activities in place. So whatever our last observation really fairly well represents where the activities stop, and then we can project that they are holding on average steady according to the other previous observations of the time. And then once we experience the next valid observation, we adjust our predictions based on the observed data. The difference between these gray vertical lines shows the monsoon from the beginning of June through probably the end of August. Here, the monsoon period is even greater. It goes through May to practically October, where you have no valid observations whatsoever. And a lot of these data are purely modeled. But we are able to reconstruct fairly well NDVI, and it does match the observations at the end of the period. So for exposure, we're looking at population distribution and occupational exposure. There are wonderful gridded data sets, but they rely on existing knowledge of where people are. In Myanmar, nobody knows where people in remote rural villages are. Those maps are highly inaccurate and highly incomplete. And in many areas, there are no maps whatsoever. So what we do is we use Landsat data to develop an algorithm that picks up these fairly remote rural areas. And this is a fairly large village. This is a much smaller one. I'm particularly proud that we captured this and this, because I don't know how well you can see, but this and this are actually housing units. So we're not trying to capture the full extent. More so, we want to know that people are there. This is the general area where we have people. That's the important section there. And then using established methodologies by the gridded world population approach, right? We can distribute these census-based estimates of where people are, the population density, onto the map. And there you go. Yangon, Mandalay, Naypyidaw, right? So it is very important to be able to refresh this basic assumption, because the population in Myanmar is highly mobile. The whole villages pick up and leave and go to new areas, not every day, but fairly frequently. Land use and knowledge of land use helps us understand what it is that people do on the landscape. And then we're translating different occupations through our basic research and through consultation with local stakeholders in what it means for exposure categories. We know that urban areas practically never experience malaria. We know that plantation, logging, and mining are hotbeds of malaria. We know that forest chores are much more likely to lead to malaria transmission than crop and farming chores. So based on that, we translate our base map into different potential exposure categories. And we're ranking them in this categorical way between 1, low, and high 5, which is specific for Myanmar only, right? It's Myanmar focused model. And finally, in vulnerability, we're very fortunate to work during the time where the UN has just finished their fantastic work on understanding social vulnerability in Myanmar. And we simply restretch these values of vulnerability index that they have between 1 and 5 to create this coverage. And more importantly, to understand the access to care or the cost of access to care, we had to do a lot of work recreating the road network. The original existing road network layer works wonderfully in the central, well-known, well-mapped areas. In the areas on the outlying regions, those blue lovely road networks don't cover 1/10 of the red road networks that actually are there. We spent a lot of time rebuilding the road network pretty much through manual digitizing on Google Earth. It was tedious, but it is crucial to understand what the actual access to care is. And using that digitized layer, in addition to terrain complexity and additional database on motorized vehicle movement in the country, we were able to create this access or cost of access to care, with one dark green being low access to care and the bright red being very high access to care. So finally, we're combining these two into this single unit where hazard accounts for half, and then exposure vulnerability accounts for a quarter weight for the single unit to create this map, the model. Ooh, it's not, oh, there it is, moving again. That shows 8-day changes in malaria burden potential in Myanmar, wall to wall, at 240 nominal meter resolution. So 8-day update, considering the lag between the impact of the environment on mosquitoes and then subsequently expected rise in parasites, gives you about a month or two leeway between when we can detect the change and when the outbreak is likely to occur. That technically gives you enough time to respond to the changing environment and prepare the necessary interventions. We have executed this model now between 2016 and 2020, and we're running it for 2021 in the forecasting mode. The biggest challenge then becomes, once you run this model at that resolution for that long, you end up with a tremendous amount of data that you really struggle to figure out how to analyze. So how do you understand the changing risk for malaria across the country? The majority of the country is under fairly low malaria risk, but some areas are much more impacted than others. So one way we decided to look at it is to look at mean daily area under the high, moderate to high risk definition by state, right? And you have your certain states emerging as leaders, but then the question always comes up, is it because it's a really large state? Or is it because the malaria is really high? Clearly, Naypyidaw, which is just a single urban area, is too small to ever rise to the level of Shan, which is the largest state. And so the other component that you can look at is the fraction of area within the state that is under high risk at any given time, right? Spoiler alert, Naypyidaw still doesn't have any malaria, but that was a reasonable question at the time. The interesting thing is that you start comparing the two rankings to each other. They appear to be fairly stable. There is some movement of individual states in the rankings between specific positions, but by and large, they are very, very similar. So you have your 3 top states, then which have a very high potential for malaria burden. Then you have 3 that are within the high, about 2 that are in moderate malaria burden potential, and the rest of them in fairly low. And this is what it looks like geographically. The interesting thing is these 2 are some of the most malarious cases. This is not considered to be particularly malarious, but I would argue it's because the majority of state is not properly surveyed. This is a malarious case. These two are, again, the information from there is largely lacking. So when we're starting to look over time, you can see the orange here represents Shan, the biggest state. Cayenne is shown in this burgundy and Chin in blue. You can see that they have, our model is very dynamic and it captures fairly substantial fluctuations in environmental conditions. And the interesting thing is, again, Chin, which is very much monsoon driven, has more of a stable pattern of monsoon establishment, malaria increase, malaria decrease, monsoon, malaria increase, etc. Where Shan, which is less monsoon impacted, has a much more irregular pattern of environmental conditions that create very high conditions and then rapidly decline into low ones. Similarly, we have very different patterns for areas of high risk and areas of moderate risk, because Bago is the inside the country, whereas Tenanthiri is very much coastal on the east coast, and they have slightly different patterns, where Tenanthiri goes substantially low during the dry season, whereas Bago is fairly stable, and then similar low risk for the low areas, with the city states, Yangon, Mandalay, and Naypyidaw are practically flatlining through the whole time. Similar patterns, interestingly, emerge at the township level. Those are equivalents of counties in the US. So if we look at one of our most malarious states, Chin State, and we look at individual counties, we have very similar parameters, similar rankings by area and by percent township. And we have the maps that show that some areas within that highly malarious state that are much more susceptible to malaria outbreaks than others. And there is definite adjacency, as you would expect, but there are areas that are not particularly malaria threatening. More importantly, as we looked longer and longer at these temporal trajectories, we realized that each of them, especially the big ones, because they're most noticeable, show a distinct trend, temporal trend, and it's growing. So when we looked at the trend line over time, over the past 5 years, what we notice is the areas that are already at highest risk of malaria outbreaks seem to have a more rapid increase in the baseline conditions compared to those states that have lower risk. And that pattern also remains when we're looking at the state levels, right? Shan, with the highest area under risk, has the greater trajectory, temporal trajectory of environmental conditions that are increasing to support more malaria in this area. Whereas in Yangon, there is no trend whatsoever, neither is one in Naypyidaw. So are we losing malaria battle in Myanmar? We may be, and that's very, very disturbing. Between this really troubling trend of possible increases in parasite density to the apparent change in environmental conditions towards supporting malaria, which we discovered in our modeling exercise, because in our model at this point, we only were able to change environmental conditions. We really didn't change social vulnerability or access to care or populational exposure. The environmental conditions are the only variables that has been changing over time. And plus, Myanmar got hit on top of that with rapid dissolution of political stability an increase in social vulnerability, reduce access to care, and interruption of all kinds of malaria interventions. And we're talking both through the military coup, and then they got hit by COVID, and they got hit really, really badly. So that brings us back to what my colleague has been calling for in 2017, saying that drug resistance continues to spread. And if it does spin out of control, we run the risk of huge resurgence. We are at a brink where this can actually happen. I would say that since 2019, we have lost ground in malaria battle in Myanmar. And it's happened at a very critical junction of growing drug resistance and insecticide resistance in mosquitoes. It seems that the environmental, climate, and land use conditions for malaria spread are becoming more favorable. And considering the political situation in the country, I would say that Earth observations are our current option to monitor malaria risk until we can re-engage with Myanmar and get it back into the global malaria elimination program. And that is very important. And I haven't even mentioned zoonotic malaria. Well, probably next time. I will have an AGU talk on the subject. So with that, thank you very much. I'm a little bit over time, but I'm happy to take any questions that you may have.
Thank you. If you have any questions, you can go ahead and unmute yourself and ask them. Or if you do not have a microphone, you can just type it in the chat and I will read it out loud. So feel free to unmute yourselves now.
Tatiana, great presentation. This is Chris Hayes. I hope you're doing well.
Hey, Chris.
I have a quick question. So obviously some of this was over my head. I think I tracked along okay. But this is a very kind of obviously big picture, kind of grand scale view, the data that you presented here. And you mentioned at the end that ultimately the goal is going to be to re-engage with Myanmar. And so I wonder, how do you think we can take this kind of top-down view of this data, of this modeling, which seems really, really powerful, and take it to the kind of metaphorical eye-level view of people in Myanmar when we're able to re-engage? What does that look like? Does it look like stakeholder conversation? Does it look like government changes? Does it look like advocacy? I'd love your thoughts.
So thank you so much, Chris. That's an excellent question. So the model that I built was designed to be the decision support model. It really is designed to provide decision makers, and I'm talking about both medical research community who never has the opportunity to study the outbreak until the outbreak is actually over, right? It just takes that long to figure out where it is and then get the funding to do this. As well as operational public health professionals to target area for malaria elimination. So what we envisioned when we designed this system, we were going to pass out both map at the village level, right? Distribution of likely hotspots for malaria elimination and tabular data by townships to indicate what the situation for the township is like to the medical officers in the local hospitals and clinics at the Ministry of Health who are tasked specifically with monitoring and combating malaria. But with the dissolution of the democratically elected government and really no replacement to date, I'm afraid that all efforts to combat malaria are non-existent right now. And before we can re-engage with the government, they need to rebuild the agencies that are responsible for malaria treatments and malaria elimination. this model is essentially ready to go, just needs to be deployed. We're also talking to wonderful organizations who are experts in disseminating the data, scientific data, model data, to operational agencies, both through NGOs and in-country government-supported agencies, to make them actionable. And we hope that we will be able to find kind of home, at least temporary, for our early warning system before the international NGOs and the government are ready to take it up.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, I agree with you. Hopefully doors will open in the future. So
It's great.
great. Thanks.
Thanks. I have several chat questions that I can just start reading out loud. So this first one is from Daila Zhang. She says, I'm a bit confused by the malaria risk maps by political state. The risk itself is not confined by the political state. Would it be better to make the maps by the natural environmental conditions, not by political boundaries?
Yes and no. There are no specific environmental barriers that are obviously separating malaria into different units, geographic units. It would make more sense, but the problem is that, again, the system is designed to support operations, and the operations are always executed at the administrative level. And that's just the reality of how governments allocate resources and how eradication campaigns are built, right? They're never done by watersheds. They're done by counties, and they're done by states. And therefore, you know, it's not any different than why is DC having different mask mandates than Prince George's County? Do the actual boundaries make sense? No, but the decisions are made at those administrative levels, and that's how they executed, and that's why we did it that way.
Thank you. Another question from Daila. She wants to know, how effective is the malaria vaccine?
It's a good question, and that's a very exciting thing. So I have not read any recent studies on malaria vaccine efficacy. And from the early results, the very, very early, before it was even published, what I remember, and I would hate if you quote me on this, but it's recorded, so somebody will. I remember it being somewhere above 50%. The efficacy wasn't very, very high, but it was better than nothing.
Okay, thank you. And then this question is from our Associate Director, Ralph. He asks, have you used any other satellite data besides MODIS?
So MODIS is our base for both vegetation stress and for land surface temperature and land surface temperature. We used Landsat fairly extensively for mapping settlements. All our settlements are really mapped at 30-meter resolution. We also use Landsat and a lot of Landsat derivatives to build our base map. And for the base map, we ingested a number of existing ready-made data sets, the global cropland extent, the global forest change, the global impervious surface, and we added components that we needed to those maps, primarily the distribution of villages in Myanmar. And that's all 30-meter based. It's really hard to pick that very, very subtle signature from coarse resolution satellites. And night lights are not even an option whatsoever. Most of those areas have no lights whatsoever, right? None. So yeah, MODIS and Landsat are the workhorses. We looked at Sentinel-1. We really wanted to use radar to map water during the monsoon season, but the complexity of the terrain and the noise just created really too much of a mess to extract meaningful data out of that. So we will not be able to.
Okay, thank you. The next chat question is from Eric Duncan. And Eric, as well as anyone else who asked me chat, you can go ahead and unmute yourself if you want me to, or if you want to participate in like a dialogue. But their question is SAR data something that can be utilized for monsoon periods? There is recently an increase in trying to create index proxies, NDVI, etc., using SAR in cloud-affected areas. Or are you satisfied with the results of the modeling that you have developed so far?
So thank you, Eric. Yes, SAR was a big hope, but again, for surface water for us. Didn't pan out. For greenness, I'm not horribly worried about greenness during the monsoon season, and here's the reason for it. Again, I approach that the exact value of NDVI is not of high importance to me. I'm using NDVI to indicate the likely lack of moisture in the environment that will impede mosquito population dynamics. During the monsoon, there is no likely moisture lack, right? It's just wet, and it's excessively wet. So for that reason, the coarse approximation of NDVI that I have is sufficient, that I wouldn't necessarily need to go to a more precise characterization of vegetation greenness there.
Okay, thank you. And this is my last chat question that everyone is free to unmute themselves. This is from Corinne Carter. They said, I realize it would be difficult to validate your model for recent times due to the political instability, but have you done any validation with historical data?
The historical data will require me to go pre-2016. And while I can do that, even at getting those data at this point is virtually impossible. The hope always was that as we deploy this model operationally, we will get feedback from our stakeholders on how well our model is performing so that we can continuously fine-tune and improve the model going forward, as we were intending to continue operations for the next 7 years. At this point, there is no way of either validating it or doing any improvements until we re-engage with Myanmar.
Okay, thank you. Oh, Eric Duncan just prefaced that he has one last question. Anyone can unmute themselves if they want. Otherwise, we can. Eric, you can as well if you want. I assume you're typing your question right now. Oh, they typed it. Eric says, have there been any attempts to apply the model to other malaria areas?
No, and the reason is we specifically developed this for Myanmar. As you see, it's not only that Myanmar is a fairly unique area. It's also all the scaling that we have done is uniquely set for Myanmar settings. So 5 is very high for Myanmar. 1 is low for Myanmar. If I were to run this model in Africa, it would be 17 all the time, because the conditions are very, very different. So the framework is readily transferable from one area to another, right? But the actual weights and the parameterization needs to be unique to every country, I would say. And I'm a big fan of unique designs because I grew up in the Soviet Union, and one thing I learned very well is one size does not fit anybody particularly well. So I think regionally, topically, country level specific models are really needed to support operational implementation. Every single setting is so unique, from less so in environmental way, more so in operational and management way. And that can make a huge difference on how successful your model is going to be.
Thank you.
Can I have a last question? This is
Oh.
Dwi Susanto.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Yes, I'm from Indonesia originally, so I'm familiar with the malaria because back then when I was a child, I got one, so at least I know. I wonder if, have you tried using the SMAP satellite, the soil moisture active passive satellite, so that can mapping the soil moisture? And then also I wonder about, do the Myanmar government use the chloroquine pill? How effective is those? And then in case you want to expand your region to Indonesia, just let me know, because I'm basically working on the, but I'm working in the ocean, but I'm familiar with the people there. So in case you want to expand with Indonesia, let me know.
Well, thank you so much. I would love to talk more about expanding to Indonesia. They also have the monkey malaria there, which is, I find fascinating and very disturbing. So Myanmar government did have access to the full suite of artemisinin-based and chloroquine-based medicines. The specific application details I'm not aware of. In terms of SMAP, 32-kilometer resolution is probably good enough for soil moisture, but I'm not sure what information it would give me. Oh, well, see, there's a difference between soil moisture and standing surface water that you need. So we haven't tried. It may be worth trying. Thank you. That's a good suggestion.
Okay, thank you. I put my email in case you want to
Thank you.
chat. So in case you want to contact me if you want to expand to Indonesia. Thank you.
Thank you.
Nice talk.
Thank you. Does anyone else have any questions? Okay, well, unless I am interrupted, thank you so much to Tatiana for giving us this great talk today, and thank you for everyone. Thank you to everyone else for showing up and supporting our seminar series. We will continue next week for our last seminar of the semester on Monday, next Monday. So thank you so much, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. So we will send you the video of your talk once we get it. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Hold on. I want to get the email from the founder. Go. Sorry.
Oh.
Yeah, no problem. I was gonna ask. Can you see it in the chat, or I can also just email it to you?
I got it.
Okay, perfect.
Thanks so much. All right, good.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.